And when we look at the Justice card, which represents Libra, we see the sword, right, which is able to slice through things to figure out, okay, what is the truth of the matter? That's one way of seeing things clearly, right, is to divide and understand through taking it piece by piece. And then another way to take right measure is to literally weigh things, take their measure of what they really are. And that's what the scale is all about.
Greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies Episode 9. I'm your host Mario, once again joined by my lovely wife Michelle. Today we'll be discussing the symbolism of Libra, the seventh sign of the zodiac. If you're new to the show, I invite special guests to submit a voicemail on the topic at hand, and also play voicemails submitted by listeners like yourself. For more information about the show, my services, or how to submit a voicemail, please visit symbolicstudies.com. If you'd like to have access to exclusive content, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/symbolicstudies or on my site. Before we dive into the first voicemail, Michelle, my dear, how are you?
I am doing great, and it is the autumn equinox today, so it's an exciting time. It's definitely my favorite time of year, and there's so many changes happening, and it's just really great to witness.
Yeah, indeed, and you're definitely in your element right now, I would say.
Yeah, the fall cleanup in the garden has begun to take place, and that's always really fun, and I just love seeing everything kind of coming back down towards the earth. It's really fun to see that in the plant life.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's called fall for a reason.
Yep.
And with Libra, it's as though we're entering into the underworld in a way. I did a whole presentation about that. So we are now in the dark side of the zodiac. I'm excited to get into it. So to kick things off for today, we've got a voicemail from our friend and regular contributor, Emily Ridout.
Hi, Mario. Hi, Michelle. This is Emily Ridout, and I am calling in to talk to you about Libra energy. I think Libra is a super fascinating zodiac sign. So it is the sign that in the tropical zodiac initiates at the autumnal equinox. It is ruled by Venus, and in it, Saturn is exalted. And on a very rudimentary level, I think Libra energy gets misinterpreted a lot as being balanced because its symbol is the balance by pop culture. So the symbol, of course, is the balance, but it's an old-fashioned balance that would swing up and down. And at its core, instead of being perfectly balanced all the time, what Libra energy truly represents is the capacity to adjust one side in order to affect another. And so in the placements, for example, of Libra individuals, whether it's the sun, the moon, another planet, the energy of that planet will have the tendency to swing up and down or to adjust itself for a circumstance or to amend a present situation or to create a future outcome that is desirable. Now, Libra energy in general is very, very good at doing this. It is the energy that rules the kidneys, and atop the kidneys sit the adrenal glands. Now, it's important to notice Libra is the opposite of Aries energy. Aries rules the brain. From the brain come particular signals that key the adrenal glands into action. And of course, the adrenal glands are what release things like adrenaline and help us to respond to stress. So the adrenals literally balance out stress in the body. If your adrenals become depleted, you get adrenal fatigue. If they become too depleted, you can actually die from stress. That's rare, but it does and can happen. Now, the kidneys also balance something very key in the body, which is the blood. The kidneys will balance out the pH level of the blood. They'll take out impurities. They'll process blood to be turned into urine. And of course, the blood is ruled by Aquarius. Libra is an air sign, and so is Aquarius. And so you see, even in the body, the Libra energy is not about perfect balance all the time. It's about adjusting something that is pre-existing, right? The stress from the brain or the environment in the case of the adrenals, or the properties within the blood to create and restore balance again. We also see that in the timing of the year. After the hot summer, Libra comes in to create and restore balance again. Likewise, it is the midway point in the snake-like path of the sun through the sky. And you'll see that very clearly reflected in the tarot. So Libra rules the Justice card. And the Hebrew letter associated with the Justice card is Lamed. And that symbol is actually something like a snake moving actively in space. And so you see that there's this active principle of the snake, much like this midway point of the pattern you see the sun make throughout the year in the sky. Of course, the Justice card, if you pull out a more traditional tarot deck and look at it, it is a blonde, typically blonde woman sitting with her scales and her sword. She's typically seated in stone between two stone pillars. And this is very similar to the imagery of the high priestess, with the stone pillars, seated in stone, seated indoors. And it's also very similar to the symbolism of the Empress, who is seated outdoors, but who has also blonde hair. And the reason for this is that the Empress and the High Priestess both represent the subconscious processing of the universe, of the cosmos. The Justice card likewise symbolizes what happens when the karma of the universe, which I'll get into karma in just a second. The karma of the universe shows up in a way so that we rightly understand it and it gets imprinted on our subconscious awareness and patternings so that we are able to take right measure of our environment, of our life situations, so that we can take the actions that will produce a desired result within the situation in which we now find ourselves. Now, I bring that up because that subconscious piece of it, which is shown in the active principle, or the procreative principle, I should say, in the Empress, who, by the way, represents Venus in the tarot, who is the ruler of Libra. That subconscious principle is able to help us to take right measure to create action. And this is where the key part of what Libra actually means comes into play, because Libra is very much associated with the idea that we have in yoga of karma. And I think karma is misunderstood. A lot of people talk about it like a sort of cosmic comeuppance, like a what goes around comes around kind of trope. But what karma literally means, from the Sanskrit root krit, means action. And so when we look at karma, we're talking about action. So your karma is what you do. Karma also implies the idea that action produces reaction. And so karma is also the result of the past actions that have produced the present circumstances in which we now find ourselves. And that doesn't have to be personal to any individual personality, right? That can be collective. All the people throughout history, all the beings, all of nature has taken a certain set of actions, and now here we are, and this is what we have. Likewise, we can take right measure of what we now have, the karma of the past, and then create, and here it is, the positive karma of taking right action to produce a desirable result. And this is where Saturn comes in, because Saturn is exalted in Libra. And in the tarot, Saturn is associated with the World card, which is the final card of the major arcana, and it shows the cosmic dancer who has reconciled all oppositions and who is now a master of the realms and able to operate on a level of total awareness and self control and control of their environment in a positive way. And so Saturn has everything to do with measurement, with restriction. And when we look at the Justice card, which represents Libra, we see the sword, right, which is able to slice through things to figure out, okay, what is the truth of the matter? That's one way of seeing things clearly, right, is to divide and understand through taking it piece by piece. And then another way to take right measure is to literally weigh things, take their measure of what they really are. And that's what the scale is all about. And so when we look here, we see something really beautiful, which is the coming together of Venus and Saturn, because Venus is actually procreative. She's trying to build. And anytime you've seen growth without the Saturn principle, it goes out of control, right? I live in an area where blackberry bushes, which are wonderful plants, right? They give you blackberries, will take over. Blackberries, by the way, are a Venusian plant, which I'm sure Michelle has probably brought up time and time again with their 5 leaves, their fruit, and their brambles. But they'll take over unless if culled in right measure. Likewise, it can be a good idea to, let's say, develop a city or to grow new cells in your body. But both of those things, without the Saturnian principle, right? Building without the Saturnian principle could be urban sprawl and just kind of not the most beautiful town or environment. And then body growth, for example, without the Saturnian principle could lead to growths or the overstepping of flesh, which results in myriad diseases. And so we see that the Saturn principle and the Venus principle together are very much a key. Likewise, and I want to bring it back to this final point, and I could just go on with this one forever, but I know I'm trying to keep it under 10 minutes here. The fact that the Justice card has a woman in it, and that it is the women in the major arcana in the tarot typically symbolize a subconscious nature. That doesn't mean inferior. That just means the power below the working level of the self-conscious mind. That this figure is representing the positive thing that happens when we correctly understand that what is at play, back to the Empress, is a cosmic principle. The Empress is crowned in stars, right? It is a cosmic principle operating through us. And so the Justice card, Libra in general, helps us to understand, yes, we are doing action, we are attempting to make right measure, but in the full dance of karma, of the collective unit of humanity, what is operative is actually a cosmic principle operating through us. And so it's the correct understanding, the correct measurement that, like, yes, we experience life as individuals, but what we're actually doing is we're acting as units of the universe, moving energy through us, bringing energy forward, and not being separate from us. So being actually beings working as the universe, not in service to it, not separate from it, but as it. And so that's the gist of just my quick 2 cents on Libra energy. I hope that this was helpful or that it can add to your conversation in some way. And if anybody wants to look more into this, come see me at the International School of Astro Yoga, or you can book readings on my website, emilyridout.com. But have beautiful days. Have a beautiful Libra season. And Mario and Michelle, love that you're doing this. Thanks so much for wanting me to send you this recording.
Okay, Emily Ridout, thank you so much for that beautiful contribution. I'm so grateful that you are a regular contributor around these parts. And overall, I just have to say, every episode when we listen to these voicemails ahead of time, I am filled with gratitude. I really am. Super blessed because these voicemails help level me up in many ways. It reminds me of a lot of information that I've read before, maybe forgot. With each sign, there's so much to get into. So anyway, just very much enjoyed and appreciated that. The first thing I'd like to say is this whole adjustment business versus balance. That is really well put. And I just have to say that the Thoth deck actually calls justice adjustment for this very reason. So Crowley actually wrote very specifically about this and how really it's about right adjustment in this world. And that basically the universe seemingly is always seeking adjustment as well. And it's always seeking balance, rather. And how is it going to achieve that balance? Through adjustment, right? Through right action, as she was kind of saying. And through this Saturnian principle. And one of the things that I always think of, sort of a visual metaphor for this, is someone spinning. Someone spinning around like a ballerina or like the whirling dervishes, something along those lines. And whenever something is spinning, it can obviously be thrown off balance, right? But it takes little micro adjustments if you're in that spin to continue spinning as well. And you'll notice too, a spinning top as an example, it can get wobbly, but then it could also self-correct, right, through that spin. And so to me, that's something I always think about. I always think about that as well because I have a couple of tarot cards and the justice figure is balancing on a sword, or they're balancing on their tippy toes, or their tippy toes are kind of in line with this sword. And it just reminds me further of this sort of balancing act, the ballerina, right, or the dancer. And so I think that's fascinating as well because there's a lot of older Venus statues, which are sort of like the oldest figurines of the goddess. They always have very pointy feet. And so there's this idea of balance kind of with that as well, right? So I thought that was all really well received. I like what she brought up with the Saturnian principle, Saturn being exalted in Libra. And she also brought up the Venusian principle as well. And I just have to say that, Saturn, we did a whole presentation episode about this a while back, about the feminine aspect of Saturn and how that's kind of lost in today's world. But Saturn was actually viewed as more of a primordial sort of goddess, feminine, great mother sort of archetype, right? And so I think that's all interesting as well because there's a whole correspondence with woman and the blade. In fact, when you're talking in terms of Western esotericism, specifically kind of the Thelemic point of view, they always say that Lady Babylon is girt with sword, right? And the sword and the scales are nearly synonymous. That's why Lady Justice is always seen with the sword. There's so much overlapping symbolism between the sword and the scales. And also there's this concept that woman herself is kind of split, right? That the yoni is kind of like an opening, a split opening. And there are myths that actually very strongly relate to this. As an example, Tiamat, this great dark mother figure, she was cut in half with a blade. And in that line of mythology, we are living within the space of Tiamat, this great mother goddess, essentially. And that we are living in between her, as above, so below. And so the sword really is just a beautiful symbol to sort of decode and analyze with Libra season. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying our discussion on Libra symbolism so far. If you aren't already aware, I have a series called Symbolic Secrets that's only available through my site or via Patreon. At the moment, I'm releasing one episode for every major arcana card and have released 17 so far. That's about 17 hours worth of exclusive content. Links for everything can be found at symbolicstudies.com, or if you want to go straight to Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/symbolicstudies. This is also the perfect way to support the show for only $5 a month. All right, back to the episode. So I could go on and on and on. These voicemails truly are layered and very deep. But Michelle, did you have anything to add?
I do. And actually, between what Emily brought here and then what you're saying, my mind is really going right now because I had some notes already after we listened to Emily initially. And now I'm putting many more things together. And, the first thing I'll go to is you bringing up the blade and the connection to woman. And that goes into the blackberries that Emily spoke of because it makes me think of a blade and a thorn and them kind of having a similar role. And so the thorn is different than a blade, obviously, but both will produce blood. And when I think of woman, blood is one of the first things I think of, actually, because there's like a blood mysteries thing. There's a darkness to it. There's the blood of creation. There is the blood that's given every month from a woman. There's the blood that comes from birth. There's the blood that happens when you cut your finger when you're cooking something. So the blood has to be there in order for these adjustments to be made or actions to be taken or balance to be brought to a situation.
Right. And, one of the things that relates to all of this is the fact that clearly, traditionally, the woman is more domestic than the male.
Right.
And in order to be domestic, you really need a good blade.
Yes, you do.
It's a core essential tool. So this is something that I think is really fascinating. When I first got into symbolism, I didn't realize that there was so much symbology or mythology that relates woman to the sword, woman to a blade, but it is definitely there. And this is probably the best sign to sort of unpack all of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then I think about the Saturn connection that Emily brings up and that marrying of Venus and Saturn and the necessity of Saturn. And I really love how she put that without Saturn in certain situations, there could be an overgrowth of something, or there might be, an issue that pops up because there wasn't something that was protecting it or containing it or even just having more of that structure, right? And I think that the balance that comes with Saturn is so necessary in life. And so another way to bring Saturn into the fold with this time of year is, as I talked about in the intro, just the plants declining. That to me is very Saturnian. When you're watching these plants going like back to the earth, they're kind of slumping over and they're losing their color. They're turning brown and they're going to start to die.
The leaves are falling, right?
Yes, the leaves are falling. And I think that this kind of goes along with that adjustment that Emily was talking about. We go from blossoms to seeds. It has to happen in order for the next season to be able to be fruitful, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it reminds me too that Saturn corresponds with the scythe as well, which is another blade. And the other thing, as you were talking about the Saturnian aspect here, that it reminded me of is the fact that, and Emily brought this up, the Hebrew letter that corresponds with justice or adjustment is Lamed. And my understanding is that Lamed, one of the interpretations of what it means is it's an ox goad, which basically is just a little tool that you have that is kind of like a whip. It's like a stick whip thing for cattle, right? And so you're kind of like using it to prod the cattle to go into the right direction. And so that's also very Saturnian. It's all lessons really are Saturnian, basically. But Saturn is one of the greatest disciplinarian planets or entities, in the zodiac system, right? So the ox goad is a very simple tool that relates to guidance and relates to adjustment and relates to sort of this paternal, maternal sort of thing of, doling out lessons in a way and making sure that they're taking care of, their flock or their herd or what have you. The other thing I'll add to the blade thorn kind of dynamic here is that Scorpio is the next sign.
Right.
And we're dealing with the scorpion stinger. And so if there is sort of a time of year that relates to the penetration of skin, bloodletting, or something along these lines, it would be this time of year. Specifically, too, I would say Scorpio with the stinger dynamic, and then also the arrow of Sagittarius, to me is at play as well. And in fact, a lot of times you will see that the arrow of Sagittarius is pointed at the Scorpion stinger, and it's been said symbolically that essentially they're one and the same. We'll get into this, in a couple of months, but Sagittarius, some older versions of Sagittarius, he literally has a scorpion's tail. That's how intermingled, these signs are. And even the scales of Libra are well known for corresponding with the claws of Scorpio. They're even called the northern and southern claw. And you can even find sky maps where literally the scorpion's claws are resting in the pans of Libra.
Wow. Yeah, so this piercing element that we're talking about, basically, whether it's a scorpion tail or an arrowhead or a thorn from a blackberry, you must remember, particularly when you're working with thorned plants or a blade or anything that could cut you, to move slow and with care and to be very present and paying attention. And I think that also goes along with this time of year. We're starting to move slower. I mean, I've already noticed the change within myself. I'm very tuned in with the seasons, and I feel like I can already notice the slowing down, the calming, there's like a more nurturing feeling in the air in this time of year, and it's really come through quite strongly. And so just to remember to take things slower. And the blackberries, if you are going to be cutting them back, you are going to want to take it slow, and they're going to actually give you signs to take it slow. And if you're not taking it slow with them, you're going to get scratched and you're going to bleed.
Right. Yeah, definitely. The last thing I'll say is that, with the adjustment card or justice card, Lady Justice, she is sitting between two pillars. And so she symbolically is like this middle pillar. So she's like this middle path, I would say. And if there's one principle that I think relates to the middle path, it is being present, basically. There's a huge aspect to the middle pillar, middle path, middle way relating to presence of mind.
Indeed. One of the more challenging things to do, but it is the most essential thing that you could do in your whole entire life.
Hello, Mari and Michelle. Thank you again for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about Libra's iconography. In particular, I wanted to talk about its glyph and bird symbolism. Libra is undoubtedly one of the most abstract of the zodiacal signs, which has resulted in a vast number of portrayals. It's been described as a measuring beam in the Dendera zodiac, as a bridge, claws, a yoke, and even referred to as the Tower of Babel. But it's most widely represented as the uterine-shaped scales. Libra is a cardinal air sign, corresponding to the Justice card in Tarot. Justice also happens to be one of the 4 cardinal virtues, as first expounded by Plato in the Republic. The other virtues we also find in the Tarot are strength, temperance, and prudence. The word cardinal stems from the Latin root cardo, meaning a hinge, a pivot, like we find in the fulcrum of a scales, but also representative of that transition or adjustment of light from the sun in the change of seasons. No wonder the equinoxes fall in the Aries-Libra axes. Which brings me to the parallel of the Aries glyph to the scales. They both have 2 symmetrical or equal arms branching out from a central pole, reiterating this idea of balance of opposites. And this made me surprisingly think of the Elder Futhak rune, the Dagas, which means day, and it resembles 2 equal triangles mirrored, much like butterfly wings. The Dagas also represents the balance of opposites. You could say it sort of looks like a triangular infinity symbol. Surprisingly, the Libra card is number 8 in the tarot systems, or sometimes 11. Now, for the Libra glyph itself, when I look at it, I have always seen a pregnant belly lying down, or a bridge, or a tunnel, or a cave. The glyph has often been compared to the Omega symbol as well, which, if you search up Hathor's hairstyle, there's an uncanny resemblance to it. Now, we know from your Taurus episode on the podcast that Hathor, the cow goddess, has a correspondence with Venus as the ruler of Taurus, and the Hebrew Aleph, or the Alpha, is associated with Taurus. Then we find the omega-like symbol for Libra, also ruled by Venus. Hence, I propose Venus is the embodiment of the Alpha and Omega, which ties into the oldest written resurrection myth contained in the Descent of Inanna. Now, I want to come back specifically to the Libra glyph and how it relates to pregnancy. September is the 9th month and 9 months for human gestation. But if we were to flip the glyph upright, vertically, the outward protruding arch resembles a belly, and the inward curve looks similar to the lumbar spine of a human. Libra, in medical astrology, governs the lower back, the lumbar spine, and kidneys. I've heard in Chinese medicine, the lumbar spine, which naturally curves inward, is described as a crossroad point in the body, as the gate of life or the gate of power, and is sometimes referred to as the center of vitality, because any symptoms of pain in this area of the body is indicative of imbalances in the yin and the yang energies. The lumbar spine is like the fulcrum in the scales. It forms a nexus, and it's crucial for our balance and for absorbing shock. It is called the gate of life or point of origin because it is also the area in the body where the embryo develops. Now, directly in line with our lumbar spine is our navel, the omphalos of the world, which Virgo happens to govern the belly button or the navel, which I sort of see as like a keystone in that arched pregnant belly. Curiously, we also find the Omega symbol on the badge for the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. But before I briefly touch on bird symbolism, I wanted to share another coincidental correlation between the runes and Libra. I know Michelle loves the runic system too, so this is for you, Michelle. In Vedic astrology, Libra is Tula, the word for scales or balance, and the period it occurs in sidereal is mid-October to mid-November, and that period is called Isa, which in Sanskrit translates to ruler or master. And as you know, there's a rune called Isa, meaning ice, literally, but symbolically refers to stasis or balance, stability, and standstill. Curiously, Isa also has an Arabic connection, which translates as messenger of God, or is sometimes used as the name for Jesus. I also see a lot of tree of life symbolism, and one motif in particular I'd like to touch on is the bird. Birds traverse all realms. They fly high to the heavens, nest on the land, and can dive deep to the watery underworld. They are just as prolific as snakes, and for good reason too, because they share in the symbolism of birth, death, rebirth. In the ancient world, birds were thought to be twice born, the egg and the hatchling. Winged women predate the angels of the Abrahamic religions. Across cultures and times, we find bird-like women from the primordial bird goddess clay figurines from the later Paleolithic to the bird-like woman in the Bernese relief, also known as the Queen of the Night, who is still debated today as either being Ereshkigal or Inanna or Lilith, to the more popular iconography of the Sirens, who were the handmaidens of Persephone, the Valkyries, who were known as the choosers of the slain, and of course the Furies, who acted as the punishers for the gods, not to mention the numerous winged goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon. So why is it we see birds in this capacity as guides for the souls, as punishment and judgment, as it pertains to death, like we see reflected in such deities as the Egyptian Mat, with the weighing of the heart ceremony? I believe it can be traced back to primordial traditions of sky burials, where the dead body was laid out on a towering altar or scaffolding platform, or sometimes even trees, for carrion birds to excarnate the bodies, meaning they're stripping away the flesh from the bones, which would later be retrieved for burial. As we see, women dominate in the process of childbirth, obviously. So too did they primarily act as the caretakers of the dead, washing and preparing the bodies for funerary customs, even up to biblical times, as is referenced with Jesus's entombing. I'll end here circling back to the idea of the light of the sun, association with the equinox, with relation to the ostriches, who are referred in a text from the New Kingdom describing the ostrich as greeting the dawn by dancing in honor of the sun. The ostrich can be traced far back to pre-dynastic Egypt, among their oldest petroglyphs, as the Egyptians believed that unlike other birds, the ostrich has all its feathers equal. So yeah, that's just a couple of different random thoughts there. I'm sure you'll have a lot of threads to pull at. So thanks again for your time.
Okay, Katriena, thank you so much for that. One of the things right off the bat that I have to say, I really appreciate the fact that she brought up the origin of the word cardinal, with the fact that we're dealing with a cardinal sign.
Right.
And it being cardo, which apparently she says represents a hinge or point of pivot. That is kind of mind-blowing. I've never heard that before, but it makes so much sense. And I'll tell you what, it's fascinating because the pole essentially represents a point of pivot as well. As an example, the pole star, because it's the center of the wheel of heaven. So all of the fixed stars revolve around that point of pivot. And it's interesting. I've read that the equinoxes and the solstices were once really truly thought of as poles, basically. So the pole between Libra and Aries, or the pole between Capricorn and Cancer, right? Beginning the seasons. And so to me, this lines up with a few things that we're discussing here that I think are very much relevant.
Well, speaking of the pole, I knew we were going to get here because as I was researching Libra, I came across multiple quotes about the pole star and what that means. But from the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols comes the quote, "The Sanskrit word for scales, tula, is the same as that for Holy Land, located in the north, that is at the pole."
Yep, exactly right. Well, one of the things that's also in that book, and I recommend, this is one of the books that I tell, students and clients to get, is the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols. It is one of the best symbolic dictionaries you can get your hands on, and it's readily available. It's cheap. The entries are absolutely fantastic. And when you look into the scale entry, there's something in there about Chinese secret societies way back when viewing Ursa Major and Ursa Minor not as dippers, as we currently know them, or bears, as most people know them, but actually as pans of a great scale. And so that it's a cosmic scale, and literally the world axis, which extends from the North Pole through the pole star, is basically the central pillar in the scale, right? And so this is something that I've talked about before. I'm just going to plug real quick my presentation that I gave in person last year for a Robert Phoenix event. It's called The Axis of Libra, and I talk about this dynamic at length. So if people want to know more about this specific thing, you should definitely check that out. But if you just imagine you have two scales, you have two pans, you're weighing opposites, right? Or you're weighing two things against each other. Symbolically, you can view one pan as being masculine and the other pan as being feminine, or one pan as being light or dark or what have you. And so in order for the scale to even function, you need to have a central point of pivot. So it's almost as though the scale in and of itself doesn't just represent two pillars, the left pan and the right pan. There's also the central column that allows the whole entire system to even work to begin with. And so that central column, to me, is very much emblematic of the central pillar, right? And once again, Justice sits between two pillars. She symbolically is that central pillar. And central pillar symbolism relates very strongly to world axis symbolism. So to me, there's almost this kind of complete loop with everything that's going on here. So I wanted to mention sort of the pole aspect with literally the equinoxes and then also the solstices. And then that weaves in perfectly with what you just said right there.
And I also have it written down here from the Penguin Dictionary. They referred to these scales as the jade scales.
That's right. Exactly right. Yep, for sure. And so even jade scales, old school jade scales, if I'm not mistaken, they work more in a way of what Emily was talking about earlier. It's not completely symmetrical the way we typically imagine scales. But yes, you're exactly right. I love that. That's so fascinating to me. And speaking of poles of the year as well, this relationship between Libra and Aries that Katriena brought up is interesting to me. She was bringing up some of the symbolism that relates between the two glyphs and things like that. And it's interesting to me that a lot of old scales, when you're looking at reliefs or paintings that are about the weighing of the souls ritual, the scale basically looks like a cross. It looks like a cross, and then it looks like it has the two pans hanging from the cross beam of that cross. And to me, this is very deliberate. A lot of cross symbolism is baked into Aries symbolism. Christ, as an example, was crucified on the cross during Aries season itself. And so to me, there's just kind of this innate relationship with the cross as it relates to Aries. And then you could also see that with how a lot of scales are depicted as basically a simple cross. Also, what Katriena was saying regarding the glyph of Libra and how she's imagining sort of this keystone at the very top of that bubble of the top line of the Libra symbol. I think that's really appropriate as well, because I've put out there that it seems to me there may be this dynamic where that little bubble of the top line of the Libra symbol, it kind of reminds me of the firmament. It kind of reminds me of a dome of sorts. And when we're talking about a dome, we're always talking about the heavens. And so the very top of that dome would be sort of the symbolic exit out of the firmament, or would be the northern sky, which has a clear correspondence with the keystone as well. So those are a few things off the top of my head that I wanted to discuss. What about you, Bob?
Yeah, man, Katriena, thank you again. And thank you for bringing up the runes, because, you know, I'm so glad you went there. And as soon as I heard you say dagas and then I drew out dagas, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is perfect for Libra. And as Katriena brought up, dagas does look like a triangular infinity sign.
Right. It's like two triangles touching tip to tip.
Yes, sideways.
Yep.
And then Isa, on the other hand, Isa is a vertical line. And when you put these two together into what we would call a bind rune, you do get what looks like a scale, because Isa is that middle point, and then you put the 2 points of the triangle right in the middle of that vertical line, and it is a balance. And dagas is also sometimes known as a rune of day and night. And I learned that from Ingrid Kincaid. And what Ingrid also says about dagas, she says, dagas contains both sunset and sunrise, the power of night and day, dark and light, as well as the point of intersection, the still point, the threshold, the liminal space. And now for me, that is really one of the best explanations of dagas that I've come across, because the liminal space is this time of year. It's also what Ingrid talks about. It's like almost like the space of like nothingness, or it's the still point. Mm-hmm. So there's actually action happening in stillness. And that's something to always kind of keep in mind. Like being still, you're taking action by being still. You may not be moving, but there's still an action happening within that stillness, because within stillness is when gestation can happen. And she brings in the example of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. There's that time when the caterpillar is inside the cocoon, but it basically kind of turns into like this goop. And it's kind of like a nothing thing, but it soon will be a butterfly.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is literally one of the things that I pretty much bring up most tarot readings because it's relevant all the time. But this idea of being the unmoved mover, mm-hmm. the prime mover at the center of the wheel. And by being stationary, immutable, and at that still point in the middle, you cause the wheel to turn. That's the whole entire thing. And so really the still point in the middle of the wheel, as an example, the axle of the wheel, or the axis, the world axis, symbolically, metaphysically, that is actually more primary and important to movement than like action itself. That's the whole entire thing behind it. And so, yeah, everything you're saying from Ingrid's book, I mean, that is so encoded with Libra stuff, for sure.
Yeah, it really is. It's actually quite beautiful. And this, just as a note for anyone who's interested, this is from Ingrid's book, The Runes Revealed, An Unfamiliar Journey. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can find it in her book. The other thing that I really love that Katriena brought to the table is birds. And as you know, babe, birds have been in our weave quite heavily over the last few years. I feel as though I have a role of being a guardian of the birds out here right now. I'm always looking out for them, trying to make sure they've got water and seeds.
I didn't want to say anything, but you're starting to look more bird-like these days as well. So they're really rubbing off on you.
Wow, well, that's pretty cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, man, I'm okay with it because I learned a lot about birds as I was studying Libra, more than I have already known. But, some schools of thought look at birds as reincarnated souls. So they are recently passed. They have come back to this realm as a bird. And to me, that's pretty appropriate given the role of a bird and their movements, their creatures of air, and also just the connection with the feather and Ma'at and Libra and the weighing of the souls ritual. It all kind of goes together. And this aerial burial, that's really interesting as well.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So maybe it's worth expanding on the weighing of the souls ritual briefly and how it relates to air symbolism and things like that. So the idea was that upon death, your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which is known as the feather of truth. I think I've read that this feather potentially belonged to two different types of birds, depending on maybe the translation. I'm not sure. The ostrich definitely comes to mind, and then also the vulture is something that comes to mind as well, which I think is really interesting. And so your heart is weighed against this feather. If it's heavier than the feather, that is not favorable for the afterlife transition. If it's lighter than the feather, that is favorable for the afterlife transition. And so to me, it's always just a reminder to live lightly, basically. And this is part of the symbolism, the practical symbolism of the Fool card. The Fool, it relates to air symbolism. He often has a feather plume in his cap, and it looks like he's living lightly. And he's at elevation, so it's almost like the air is even thinner, right? Or there's less oxygen up there. And so he's living lightly, he's living in the moment, and he's not bringing too much with him. He always has his bindle, which is that little sack at the end of that stick. And so when you are a traveler, if you're a true traveler, you're probably packing lightly. You can't bring all of your belongings with you. And so to me, this kind of translates over to how we should all live life is you don't want to be weighed down with baggage. And I would say it can be viewed as emotional baggage, spiritual baggage, psychological baggage, however you want to frame it. You should basically use your sword, your symbolic sword, to cut cords and to live lightly and to basically let go of things. That is one of the best things with sword symbolism that I can say is that we all need to wield our sword so that we can let go of some of this baggage that's weighing us down so we can live lightly. So upon death, symbolically, your soul can ascend, right? And so if you have too much baggage, it's literally like being weighed down. And I actually think we have a voicemail coming up that's going to speak to the weighing of the souls thing as well for people who are interested. Great stuff all around.
It really is. And the other thing that comes to mind with the, weighing of the souls or weighing your heart against a feather, I think it's also the reminder of during your lifetime to not become so attached to the physical things that are here. So and that's what people become obsessed with. It's the houses, the cars, the finances, the this, the that, all the things that we can acquire. I think that plays a role in the afterlife of what was your main goal when you were spending your time here as a living being? Were you so focused on all the physical things that you actually never really stepped into that emotional side of yourself? That's really going to be more weight on your heart than you might actually realize.
And this is really why birds are valued and looked at as angelic or as spiritual and things like that. Even it's really common, like in Christian iconography, the dove. The dove is present in a lot of Christian works of art, and oftentimes it is like the central sort of icon or the most ascended icon or something along these lines because of their seeming weightlessness, right? And their ability to fly and everything else. This is why angels have wings, And so this is a whole deep side of things. I could get further into the weeds with everything, but I'll have to save it for another time.
Hello, Mario and Michelle. This is Sarah, once again joining you with some insights on the sign of Libra. Libra, the scales. We think of balance, we think of justice, we think of truth. It's a unit of measurement, as well as translating to mean pound. It's the only sign, curiously, that is actually represented by an object as opposed to a living creature. And we know that the zodiac in the Greek, zodiakos, means circle of animals or little animal. But this is not an animal. But as we look back through the tomes of antiquity, we'll find that this actually used to be a part of the Scorpio constellation and was actually the claws or the horns of the scorpion. This time of year in the northern hemisphere, we're experiencing the fall equinox, which falls during this sign. And in the Latin, equinox means equal night. This is when daylight and nighttime darkness are of approximate equal duration across the planet. And how fitting is that? But this is also the part of the zodiac that I lovingly call going through the looking glass. We are entering into the underworld where we're going to meet curious things such as an object in place of a living creature, composite creatures, objects and items, creatures that have dual and hidden meaning. Not only do we meet Libra, who is the scales and an object, but we meet Scorpio next, who is represented by a scorpion, which is a desert dweller, and yet we've placed it as a water sign. We meet the Sagittarius, who's half horse and half human, wielding the only weapon that we see within the zodiac, the bow and arrow. Next up, we have the Capricorn, part goat, part fish, but we've labeled it as an earth sign, only recognizing one portion of it. Followed by Aquarius, the water bearer. And though that sign is pouring out water into the fish's mouth, we've designated it as an air sign. But we'll come to find that all these curious creatures that we meet on the dark part of the wheel of the year have a beautiful thread that when they are connected and woven together, create a beautiful tapestry, a beautiful story if we step back to look at the grand design, and that all these symbols and signs and meanings have a beautiful dance as they move in unison together throughout our starry skies. For my references today, I'm pulling from the books Babylonian Star Lore by Gavin White, personal favorite of mine, The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spencer, the chapters of Coming Forth by Day, which are also known as the Egyptian funerary texts or the Book of the Dead, the Bible, Anatomy of the Psyche by Edward Edinger, Psychology and Alchemy by Carl Jung, General Chemistry by Witten and Gailey, The Philosophy of Natural Magic by Henry Cornelius Agrippa, and Tables of Alchemical Symbols and Gematria by Philip Wheeler. Now we'll start in Babylonian star lore with their star maps, and we see here that the scales are not in fact a thing. They are the scorpion's claws or the scorpion's horns. And something quite interesting to note is the fact that they associate the claws of the scorpion, what would be the scales, with the planet Saturn. And even on the star map, you can see that they have placed the sigil or the marker for Saturn in between the furrow, which we met last time with Virgo, and between the scales or the claws of the scorpion. So that makes me think once again of that beautiful photograph of the Virgin standing at the broken pillar, and old man Saturn is playing with her hair. Here we see that in the star map, that following the Virgin is the planet Saturn, followed by the scales. And as we heard Mario speaking regarding the Coma Berenices, the hare constellation, that picture begins to make a lot more sense, because not only is the Virgin standing there with old man time or old man Saturn, but he's playing with her hair. I thought that was just an interesting little note. But the fact that they have Saturn exalted here as opposed to Venus, which Venus is listed as the ruling planet for this sign, we see it multiple times within the Babylonian Mulapan that it is associated with Saturn. And the fact that they also call Saturn the star of truth and justice. It's the star of the sun. And that goes right back into the very meaning of Libra being justice, truth, balance, equality. And then it's not until the Romans, and they were the first to define Libra as a separate constellation in approximately the 1st century AD. And here we meet Estrella again, representing truth and justice. And for the Romans, the sign of Libra was their goddess Estrella holding the scales of justice, until they started to then pull her and associate her more with the constellation of Virgo. And so it's here that we then begin to get more myths associated with Libra, because prior to that, they were recognized as a part of Scorpio. And so back to Estrella we go, after we talked about her extensively in Virgo. And we meet her again in Book 5 of The Fairy Queen. There is a knight named Arthegal, who is trained in the ways of justice since his youth by Estrella. He's an expert swordsman, and a special blade, a special sword is crafted for him. And the metal is unexplained, but it's called the perfect metal. And she decides that when she leaves the heavens due to all the wickedness of mankind upon the earth, she doesn't leave this knight that she has trained in her ways of justice and truth alone. In fact, she leaves behind a man made of iron by the name of Talos. And Talos would execute all of Arthegal's commands. And funny enough, here we meet basically our first robot in the halls of myth, our first automatron. And Talos is represented in a multitude of stories, and not just in the Fairy Queen, but even older, he was actually made of bronze and protected Crete. He was a gift given by Zeus to his lover Europa and created by Hephaestus. You'll also hear the name, for those of you who are gamers out there, Talos is quite popular in the Elder Scrolls. But he was a representative of protection, justice, and even retribution. And it says of him, his name was Talos, made of iron mold, immovable, resistless, without end, who in his hand an iron flail did hold, with which he threshed out falsehood and did truth unfold. And so Book 5 of The Fairy Queen, we follow the knight and Talos through their many adventures, until at one point they come upon a beach, and there is a giant who's holding a huge pair of scales and boldly proclaiming that he could weigh and balance anything. So Arthegal decides that he's going to challenge this giant and his scales to see if they can weigh right versus wrong. And they find that they have a very difficult time in doing so. And it says, first the right he put into the scale, and then the giant strove with puissance strong to fill the other scale with so much wrong, but all the wrongs that he therein could lay might not it pease. Yet he did labor long, and swat and chafed and proud every way. Yet all the wrongs could not a little right down lay. So we see that the scales of justice, it is almost quite impossible to outweigh even a little right with any quantity of the wrong. And so we come to the Egyptian star map and the Egyptian funerary texts, and we do see that a pair of scales follows their version of Virgo in their star map. And here we have scales, and the scales in Egypt are attributed to a goddess by the name of Ma'at. And she is basically the equivalent to Estrella, representing truth and justice. And she is a representative of balance and order. She regulated the stars and the seasons and helped bring order from chaos. And one of her major components in the Egyptian funerary texts is her weighing of each mortal who died, weighing their heart against her feather, her ostrich feather, in her scales. And it was determined where this deceased human would go based upon whether their heart was lighter than her feather, equal to her feather, or heavier than her feather within the scales. And so we see here that this is a very interesting representation of whatever your heart is filled with, that is going to basically determine where you go in the afterlife. So one could assume that if your heart were filled with material things, things that would be heavy, things that would tie you to the earth, money, gold, riches, houses, cars, or chariots or wagons for that time, that your heart would tend to be heavy. But if you filled your heart with more spiritual things, more emotional things, friendship, love, compassion, connection, that it would then be lighter. And what's interesting is we see this echoed in the Bible through a couple quotes from Jesus that I'm going to pull from. So we have here in the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, Jesus states, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And again in the book of Luke, chapter 17, verses 20 to 21, "Now he was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come. He answered them and said, 'The kingdom of God does not come with observation, nor will they say, see here or see there, for indeed the kingdom of God is within you.'" And once again, the book of Luke, chapter 6, verses 43 to 45, "A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. A tree is identified by its fruit. Figs are neither gathered from thorn bushes, and grapes are not picked from bramble bushes. A good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. For what you say flows from what is in your heart." So once again, reiterating that within our hearts is basically where the kingdom is, where our afterlife is, where heaven is. So what you fill your heart with is going to determine basically where you go from here after this mortal life. So instead of accumulating things that weigh you down, perhaps accumulate the things that fill your heart with light, that fill your heart with joy and love. And finally, we come to a more chemical side of this sign. And what we see in alchemy is that each sign of the zodiac actually represents a different phase of the great work or the magnum opus. And here, the sign of Libra, the little sign of the scales, stands for sublimation. And sublimation is absolutely fascinating. In chemistry, it is the actual transformation or transition of a substance directly from a solid to a gas state without passing through a liquid state. And probably the best example of this is dry ice at room temperature. The solid literally evaporates. It doesn't turn into a liquid. So it goes from solid to gas. And when we talk about the word sublimation or the word sublime, we come into its literal translation as meaning high or elevate, up to the oblique. We use the word sublime not only to talk about the chemical transition phase, but also to talk about something of great worth, something almost heavenly, something divine. So when we then apply this context to alchemy, we are talking about taking the base, cruder form of our human nature, the animal form, and elevating it, subliming it, lifting it to the spiritual, to the noble, to the greater. We are refining it by taking it out of just its very human and animalistic thinking, just wanting those very basic needs. If we were to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of wanting to eat and have shelter and breed, but taking those very basic parts of ourselves and refining them and lifting them up and seeking those higher levels of spiritual attainment. And when we talk about that purification, that sublimation, we find in the book of Anatomy of the Psyche and also the psychology put forth by Carl Jung, it states, this indicates that the crucial feature of sublimation is an elevating process whereby a low substance is translated into a higher form by an ascending movement. And once again, in the process of sublimation, the spiritual is raised from the corporeal, substilled, and the pure separated from the impure. Here, sublimation is described as a purification. And how appropriate for an air sign, this whole act of sublimation, whether we view it from the chemical standpoint or the alchemical standpoint, that it would be a representative of spirit. And so to end this little chat about Libra, we see how the scales are combined with the sign before it in Virgo and the sign coming after it, Scorpio. We see Mott holding her scales at the threshold of death and determining where we go in the afterlife. We see the maiden, the harvest maiden, life in the scales with death on the other side. We see virtue, truth, justice, and sublimation balancing in these scales with Scorpio, who we'll talk about next, representing death, transformation, secrets, so much fascinating stuff. So thank you for letting me ramble on, and I look forward to speaking with you guys again next month.
Thank you, Sarah, for that voicemail. Man, I feel like we're putting together a symbolic dream team of sorts.
We definitely are, actually.
And so I just, once again, I feel like I'm just a lucky boy over here, and I get to listen to these voicemails and comment on them, and people are bringing it. And so this one was no different. I'm so glad she brings these resources to the table as well. I think that's very helpful, and I'm sure there's going to be some books that I pick up upon her recommendation. Off the bat, one of the things I just want to say is that she really clarified, I think, a lot of what we were just talking about with the Weighing of the Souls ritual.
Yes, which I really appreciate.
For sure. So the quotes from the Bible and everything else, very well put and well received. I'm on board with all of that. Makes a lot of sense. You know, what's in your heart, basically. That's such a great way of putting it. What's in your heart? Is it material things? Is it things of the sort of physical world, as she was saying, gold, cars, etc., or is it more spiritual things, you know?
Right, because it even makes me think of just like physical things, even like vanity and things, these emotions like that, like the jealousy, envy. That's heavy stuff.
Yeah,
you
right.
know?
Hey there, it's Mario once again. I wanted to take a moment and let you know that I am available for tarot readings, birth chart readings, and private lessons. Long story short, if you think I can help you in your symbolic journey, I'd love to connect. All sessions are done one-on-one and take place via video chat. I've conducted hundreds of these sessions over the years, and I'm always amazed at the depth of conversation and what we're able to uncover together. All in all, it's a really good time. Should you be interested, all of those services can be booked at symbolicstudies.com. All right, back to the episode. I love the fact that she brought up the threshold of death with this ritual, and that aligns perfectly, of course, with Libra bringing us to the underworld, right? It's the sign right before Scorpio, and Scorpio is well known for corresponding with sex and death, and there's a lot of underworld themes that are going to be basically permeating this sort of time of year. But Scorpio, to me, is one of the most iconic signs that very much relates to this underworld, afterlife kind of journey. You know, all you have to do is just look at some of the holidays that take place during Scorpio season, like Halloween, right? And then also the Day of the Dead. You know, Scorpio season is just the time of year that a lot of people have suggested that this is the opportune time to communicate with your ancestors, right? The veil is thin, if you will. And I think that has to do with Scorpion Stinger as well. It's going underneath the surface of a thing, right? Very interesting stuff all around. I loved the sublimation stuff. And I'm so glad she brought up the example of dry ice as well. That's super fascinating because even as she was explaining it, I was trying to imagine what that looks like. And dry ice, yeah, that's a perfect sort of visual for everything. And so it almost seems as though you're skipping a step, right? From solid to just gas, and you're bypassing that liquid phase. So something very, very mystical about that for sure. And I think too, this is just a great reminder that there is this alchemical correspondence with the signs of the zodiac. So very much appreciate that she's bringing that to the table.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind with the sublimation and then Sarah emphasizing the root of the word sublime, when you listen to accounts of what people speculate death is like, it's more of a sublime experience. You are being elevated. You are being relieved of the earthly duty of just being here.
People always say they've gone to a better place.
Exactly.
And it's true because it's a unified place.
Right.
And so that's really the big thing, at least in my opinion. You know, this realm that we live in right now, the physical realm, it is more so related to division, separation, things like that. Obviously, there's an elegant divine aspect here, clearly, but there's a place that is even more unified. And so you're going back to source, basically. And so if you look at it like a wheel, you know, I use the wheel metaphor a lot these days, but the outside of the wheel is related to physicality. It's related to the material realm. It's related to separation, division. It's kind of not unlike a pie chart or a pizza, right? The different wedges of the pie. And the center is actually related to unification. It's where the reconciliation of opposites occurs. It's where source is located. And so that's where you want to be. You want to be in the middle of the wheel, the still point in the middle of the wheel, to become that unmoved mover, to become that prime mover. And I would say that the center of the wheel is the transcendental part of the wheel as well, right? And so basically it's like there are realms above and below, And these realms can be viewed as wheels. It's not unlike our chakra system. Chakra basically just means disc or wheel, and they're all connected through the center, which would be your spine. And so these realms basically work the same way. And so I see it that it's very toroidal in nature, right? The point of expansion is also the point of return. So the point of origin is the point of return. So everything is expressed from this central point, and then everything returns back to this central point as well. And so the center of the wheel is that point, basically. And the center of the wheel is related to the middle path or the middle way. And this relates to that central sort of column that is allowing the scales to even function, right? Where that point of pivot is, essentially. And we call angels, and we have the word angle, and people have said that there is a relationship between the word angel and angle, and it's literally just a flip of a letter, swapping two letters, really. Angel and angle. So what does that mean? How does that make sense? It makes sense when you consider that all of the angles of like a wheel or a pie chart, they all come from the center. The center is what dictates what the angles are of the lines that are expressed from it. And so angels come from where? The symbolic center. They have more of a relationship with source than we do. And so the center of the wheel would be sort of the apex of that system and is the origin of the system as well. The wheel can't function without its axle. And it is believed that this is where angelic figures actually come from. So my quick 2 cents on angels and angles. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. The angles perspective. And I got to shout out our friend Christy, because she, I remember years ago, was one of the first people that brought up angles.
Oh, yeah. She was all about it.
And the significance of it. And then I can't not think of runes when I think of angles. That was another conversation that was had with her many years ago. But because we talked about the runes earlier, and the runes come from the center. And then Isa, according to Ingrid Kincaid, who I quoted earlier, Isa contains all of the runes.
Right. Yeah.
So it's from that one vertical line, you are able to make all the runes, which then comes from that one central point that helps you create them all.
And again, the Isa rune just looks like a vertical line. It looks like a pole.
Yes.
The pole has a relationship with the center, so everything emanating from that center. And really, Hebrew actually has a correspondence that's kind of similar. They say the same thing about Yod or Yud. Yod or Yud is sort of the spark that creates the rest of the Hebrew alphabet. And because it's the simplest letter of the whole entire alphabet, the same way Isa is the simplest letter of the runic system.
Hi, Mario and Michelle. This is Chris. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and Libra is one of the signs I can speak about due to the many close relationships I've had over the years with Libras. And in fact, my partner for 15 years is a Libra. Libra, the scales, is a cardinal air sign that signifies the fall equinox when the light and dark are balanced. The word Libra in Latin means pound, or unit of weight, hence the abbreviation for pound, LB. Libra as a constellation was actually part of the constellation Scorpio up until Roman times, when they separated the scales from Scorpio. This Libra constellation was associated with trade and justice. Being associated with trade makes sense, since Libra rules the 7th house, which deals with relationships and marriage. The word Libra sounds like liber, which is Latin for book. I find this interesting since Libra is known for intellectual curiosity, logic, reasoning, fairness, and gathering all the information needed to make a decision. People born with a Libra sun are stereotypically known for their lack of decision making. I disagree. In actuality, Libras take the time to look at every possible angle or outcome of their decision so they can choose the outcome that is the most fair and just. They will often put others' needs before themselves in the spirit of this fairness. However, once they make a decision, being a cardinal sign, They are full speed ahead, ready to start. In fact, their intensity when acting on a decision is something to behold. They are ruled by the planet Venus, just like Taurus. I like to think of Libra as the light side of Venus, while Taurus is the more earthy, darker side. Libra brings out Venus's propensity for beauty, harmony, and aesthetics. Libra fosters Venusian energy that is lively, exciting, and curious, while also being in good taste. Libras are adept at social etiquette, bringing those Venusian qualities of harmony and beauty into the social realm with ease and grace. My personal relationship to the sign of Libra comes from my work as a music therapist who practices guided imagery and music, or GIM. In this work, one works with a trained fellow in the Association for Music and Imagery who acts as a guide during the session. The guide helps the imager or traveler enter an altered state of consciousness through breath work or through an imagery-based or autogenic induction. The guide then provides the traveler with a focus image. It could be a place, an image of a feeling, or an image of something resonating within the body. The guide then invites the music to join the traveler with this image. The traveler listens to the music and reports to the guide what images unfold as the music plays. Often, this work leads one to other realms of experience, including interactions with deities, archetypes, gods and goddesses, loved ones from the past, and potentially other realms of existence in our universe. The goal of the work is to bring back the knowledge and wisdom one gains from these experiences and bring them into their waking, conscious life. The music that is used is classical in nature, and there are specific pieces played in a sequence or in a music program to help one navigate their imagery process. The guide is non-directive and is there to support and encourage as the process unfolds. As part of my training in this work, I had to undergo my own experience as a traveler in GIM. My interaction with the Libra archetype occurred in a session in November 2024. I recall feeling numb and exhausted the day of the session. When I met with my guide, my gut told me exactly what program of music I needed that day. It was entitled Mournful. During the third piece of the program, which is the second movement of Henryk Górecki's Symphony No. 3, I encountered Libra. She stood tall before me. Her facial expression was stoic and stern. She showed no emotion. Behind her was the scales. On the scales was a white heart on one side and a black weight on the other. The scales were slowly tipping, with the black weight pushing downward while the white heart was pulled upward. The white heart was weeping, and I could feel the sadness of all the people within the white heart, and I cried too. I desperately asked Libra why this was happening. Her response was, "Dear child, you are not supposed to understand." I became frustrated with her and talked about all the people who are suffering. Her response was, "Suffering brings strength." I asked her what can be done, and she said, "You," meaning humanity, "are in charge of your own destiny. Things will never be the same." She then turned to stone. Later in the session, the white heart reappeared above me and symbolized for me that we, as collective humanity, need to unite to bring peace and justice to this world. This experience inspired me to reach out to friends and family who were also suffering and offer support, connection, and love, and I continue to do that to this day. I did some research on Gorecki's Third Symphony, which is titled Symphony of Sorrowful Songs. The second movement is a text in Polish that was found on wall 3 of cell number 3 in the basement of a detention facility run by Nazis in Zakopain, Poland. It was written by an 18-year-old woman named Helena Wanda Blazewska, who began her imprisonment by the Nazis on September 26, 1944, coincidentally in the sign of Libra. The English translation is, "No, mother, do not weep, most chaste Queen of Heaven, support me always." This was followed by Zaldras Mario, the opening line of the Ave Maria or Hail Mary in Polish. Interestingly, Helena was born on February 4th, 1926. So she was an Aquarius, a fellow air sign, a sign that represents collective humanity. Coincidentally, the white heart in my imagery represented the collective humanity which needs to unite to bring the light and the dark back into balance. Henryk Gorecki composed this piece between October through December 1976, and I'm curious if this piece was started in Libra season. Finally, the soprano who sings this piece is Zofia Kilanowicz, who is a Taurus, born in May, another Venusian sign. Thank you so much, Mario Michelle.
Okay, that came from Chris Gold. Thank you so much for that submission. Very interesting. I wasn't expecting a submission from Chris. We're actually collaborating on a project right now. People probably know by now that I'm a graphic designer, and he reached out. And funny enough, it actually has to do with bird symbolism, of all things. So I barely put that together right now, that he would submit something during Libra season. We've talked about birds several times today. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a perfect weave with birds, and then we are also working on a bird. I also had no idea that he had this kind of personal connection with Libra symbolism, right? It's so interesting to me that these signs really, they come at you at different times, and everyone's going to have a different sort of connection with the sign. And Libra for me took a long time actually to really come through, but now I'm all about it, and now I really, really appreciate it. But for a lot of people, I think Libra is actually one of the more elusive, kind of enigmatic signs. So I just think it's kind of cool that he would reach out right now and he had all of this to say. And I love the fact that he included music too.
Yes, same.
In the submission. That was beautiful.
Super moving, actually. I mean, it really hits on an emotional level. So that was really, really great.
Definitely, definitely. And the bird dynamic, by the way, came about because of their musicality, because they chirp and sing and everything else. Mm-hmm. So that is kind of why we chose to go in that direction. So very, very interesting. Also, just want to mention the fact that he brought up just the simple dynamic of Liber and Libra having this relationship, Liber being book. And there is so much book symbolism with Libra. Let's not forget that Libra is the first 5 letters of the word library. Mm-hmm. And so one of my best videos that I think I've put out is about Libra symbolism, and I get into all of this stuff and how literally like ledgers and documentation, legal paperwork and everything else, very Libran, in nature for sure. In fact, when we think of the law and justice and truth has been brought up multiple times today. When we say throw the book at them, right?
Yeah.
It's like, hey, let's enforce to the fullest extent the law, and let's make sure that we're going to actually, you know, deliver justice, right? And so to me, there's all sorts of different connections. Also, when you look into the legal world and when you look into the court system and everything else, there is a major, major Saturnian aspect there that is kind of undeniable. So, as an example, judges always wear black, right? Black is the color of Saturn. And Saturn, once again, is exalted in Libra. So, there's a ton of things to kind of riff on with that. But this idea of journeying with music and kind of getting into that kind of headspace or that emotional space, to me, is really, really interesting and really fascinating. And it kind of speaks to some of what we were talking about earlier, perhaps, with liminal spaces, right? And things like that. And the equinox being equal parts day and night. And then also this idea of adjustment, sort of bringing balance. And I think of therapy, whatever that might look like for you, it's all in an effort to restore balance or to make adjustments, right? So that maybe you even have just a more balanced, harmonious sort of life.
Yeah. And, Chris, I'm so glad that you shared all you did because it makes me very interested in your line of work. And I am a huge music lover, always have been. And it's something that's like embedded in me. And I find that music is one of the things that can move almost anyone. Someone you may categorize as has a heart of stone or something can sometimes be moved by a piece of music. So it makes so much sense that you're able to take people into this liminal space. And, the liminal space thing comes back to this time of year as what we were talking about with our ancestors and being able to communicate with them. And there's always this thing about the veil being lifted or the veil is thin, and what does that mean? And it kind of is kind of coming into this center point of the year, this equal point of the year, and slowing down to actually take the time to tune in, because I think that we can tune into our ancestors whenever we want at whatever time of year it is, but it takes effort and you have to stop and slow down in order to do it because they're in a different realm that works way differently than where we are.
Oh yeah, it works much differently.
Yeah, it is like obviously night and day.
Well, symbolically, if I've never said this on this program, music actually is closer to spirit than, say, visual art. So if we're going to look at kind of two main camps of art, there's artwork that unfolds over time. And this would be what's auditory, music, poetry, the spoken word, the oral tradition, right? And then there's artwork that's more visual. It unfolds over space. So that would be painting, sculptures, architecture, things like that. That's my bread and butter, is visual artwork. It's what I've always been interested in. And of course, I'm a music lover as well. But the more and more I learn about music, it really has this kind of ability to cut through the noise, to kind of cut through, just like what you're saying, someone who has a heart of stone or whatever, even they may weep when they hear something, or they might feel moved when they hear something. So there is more of sort of an etheric spiritual quality to music than there is to visual art. And I'm a visual artist. And so just to say, I'm biased towards that, but I understand now that there is kind of this difference. And actually, Rene Guénon, he wrote about this, quite a bit. And so he's the one who kind of schooled me on that. And when you think about it, it makes all of the sense in the world that would be the case, So with all that said, Chris, thanks again. It was a pleasant surprise to get a submission, and on to the next one.
Studies peeps. Thank you, Mario, for asking me to contribute to this Libra video. It's certainly a sign I know a lot about. I am a Libra myself, Libra Sun, Libra Venus, the ruling planet of Libra. I have natally in Libra. And I also have my South Node there. And the South Node symbolically is associated with like the things we have worked through our past lives to master and understand. And so I feel like maybe I would have a lot to say about this sign. I definitely find it extremely interesting. So before I get into it, I do want to introduce myself a little bit. Hi guys, my name is Allie. Online, I'm known as the Cosmic Space Witch. I'm a professional astrologer, and I practice what I call galactic esoteric astrology. And so I integrate into my practice a lot of things that you don't see in traditional astrological practices, including black holes and other galaxies, asteroids, fixed stars. Fixed stars are a major passion of mine. And Mario and I have connected over our love, our joint love over the pole star. And so while I'm sure many of you are going to have very insightful things to share on some of the more traditional aspects and like esoteric symbolism of Libra, I want to go ahead and kind of touch on some of the more galactic aspects of the sign, some of the really profound, super profound galactic points that fall here in this sign, and their like esoteric symbolism, which is, what I practice. In my sessions, I focus a lot on fixed star alignments, on black hole alignments, and really this concept of as above, so below, which is something I'm sure we're all familiar with, but I take it like very literally. I don't just focus on the traditional planets transiting around the ecliptic and the 12 signs of the zodiac. I really feel that the entire as above is mirrored in the so below, and that everything that's happening up there is mirrored down here in some way, shape, or form. And so I really look at like a holistic view of the sky, from the North Pole to the South Pole, all 88 constellations and everything in between. And Libra is really a profound sign. I mean, we already know it's one of the 4 cardinal signs, right? And the start of Libra starts the equinox. The fall equinox here in the northern hemisphere, and the spring equinox down below. And this in and of itself is really significant, right? This is where Libra gets a lot of its symbolism of balance, because at the equinox, the sun is crossing the equator. It's crossing the middle of the earth. And we also have this perfect balance between day and night, and a light and dark. We have this equilibrium, really symbolic of the equator, really symbolic of the balance between light and dark. Libra really is that middle path between extremes. And we see this symbolized in many different places in the sign of Libra. Right? Not only, of course, the equinox degree, the balance between light and dark, but also in the concept of the zodiacal man, where the as above is mirrored in the so below, our bodies. Libra governs the middle of the body, where the torso connects to the bottom extremities, the legs, right? It is really strongly tied to the kind of like lower back, which holds us up. It's like really also the point in the body where the serpent of, our Kundalini activation point really is anchored, that lower back. Me as a Libra, I have a lot of lower back problems. I also have a lot of problems with the kidneys, which also is associated with Libra and found there in the lower back. And a lot of times it's said that these problems stem from Libra really trying to find this sense of perfect balance. But we see this mirrored in our bodies, and we also see this mirrored in the sky. There are many profound galactic things going on in Libra. Right at the start of Libra, at 2 degrees of Libra, so pretty much aligned with the equinox degree, which is 0 degrees of Libra, we have the supergalactic center, sometimes known as M87. It's a supermassive black hole. It was actually the first black hole that we ever got a picture of. So if you remember back in 2019, when that little red circle was floating around, pictures of that were floating around, and they were like, hey, we got a picture of a black hole. That was the supergalactic center. And that is the center of our supercluster. And so we know we live in the solar system, right, where we revolve around the sun, and then many of us, we know that we live in a galaxy that revolves around the galactic center, the center of our own galaxy, but we're also part of a super cluster of over 2,000 galaxies known as the Virgo supercluster. And the supergalactic center is the center of that, holding it all together. It's this massive gravitational point that brings us together into relationships with other galaxies, into a unified force of really 2,000 galaxies. And so we know Libra is associated with relationships, partnerships, marriage, relating me to you, right? And we see this literally mirrored in the as above, as this is where we have our anchor point that ties us to our super cluster, our bigger cosmic logos, our bigger cosmic mind, of which the Milky Way, the Andromeda Galaxy, and thousands of other galaxies are a part of. It is our bigger cosmic home. I'm just crossing things off here on this list of all the things I want to talk about. Mario knows I'm super long-winded and I could talk about this stuff for hours. It's so hard for me to fit this into 10 minutes. I'm trying, Mario. I'm trying. Another thing in Libra that is super cool and really speaks to the duality and the balance between light and dark is that in Libra, we have our biggest void and also really big clusters. And so there is this place in space called the Boots. I know I pronounced that word wrong, but it sure looks like it says boots. Some people call it booties. I don't know. I say boots. The Boots super void. And it's this place in space that is pretty desolate and doesn't have a lot of galaxies or a lot of stars. And it looks like a big gaping void in the fabric of space. And that sits in Libra. And it is sandwiched by some of the biggest clusters of stars and galaxies that we have in our local space, right? And that's the Hercules supercluster, and then also the Corona Borealis supercluster. Really big clusters of stars and galaxies, really dense areas of light sit in Libra, as does this void, this absence of light, which is just so Libra. It is so the balance between yin and yang, light and dark. I actually use the yin yang glyph in my charts for the supergalactic center because I think it just symbolizes it perfectly. That unifying force between opposites. Right? And so, yeah, in Libra, we have the biggest void in space and then also sandwiched by some of the biggest clusters of stars and galaxies. Now, arguably, the most interesting thing beyond the supergalactic center in Libra for me, and I'm sure, Mario, you will find this interesting, and I'm sure you know about this. I think I've told you this before. In Libra, actually running through the Coma constellation, Coma Berenice, which I know Mario has told you about, the hidden missing constellation that now is depicted as a wig, but it used to be this divine mother and divine child. Sometimes it's called the desired son. But running through that constellation that was hidden from us for so long and really erased into something so meaningless when it is so meaningful, running right through that constellation is the North Galactic Pole. So I'm sure if you follow Mario's work, you are familiar with the importance of the North Pole and the North Star and the axis of Earth and this concept of the axis mundi or the world tree or the sacred center that we have here on Earth lining up with our pole star. Well, our galaxy, our Milky Way galaxy, also has a North Pole, and it is pointing at the Coma constellation, the constellation of the Divine Mother and Divine Child, which sits in tropical Libra. And so I find that, of course, super interesting. I'm very obsessed with the pole star, pole symbolism, and all of those things. It's actually what brought me and Mario together. I could talk about it forever. I'm trying. I'm already at 10 minutes. I'm trying so hard, Mario. I got a couple more things to cover here. All right, so we talked about the zodiacal man, we talked about the North Galactic Pole, we talked about the clusters and voids, this concept of as above, so below, the supergalactic center that really brings us together. I'm sure somebody has already talked about how the scales of Libra used to be the claws of the Scorpion, and how Libra is the only constellation of the zodiac that is a inanimate object. And it was created later. Like I said, it used to be the claws of the Scorpion. And so it really was brought into, symbolic understanding as those scales that are here to balance something. And what are we here to balance? Well, we can look and see what the scales used to be, which are the claws of the Scorpion, which has to do with our darkness and our unconscious. And how do we balance this? We balance this by leaning into the Libra archetype of the other. We balance this by seeing ourselves mirrored back to us by the other, by our relationships. We see this, we balance our darkness through the embodiment of love and justice and truth and fairness. All right, two more things. Two more things. Maybe you can cut this, Mario. I'm trying. Okay, so in Libra, we have a lot of fixed stars that I find really interesting. All right, we have several stars in the constellation of Draco. Draco circles around the celestial pole. It's a circumpolar constellation that guards the pole star. And we have three, at least more, but we have three major fixed stars in Draco that fall in the constellation of Libra, which again speaks to that unconscious. It speaks to that darkness, but it also speaks to the activation of that Kundalini, that serpent within. Arcturus also falls here. Arcturus falls in the constellation of the herdsman, and Arcturus literally translates to guardian of the bear. All right, and he is one of the constellations that is said to guard the pole star or guard a lot of the constellations around the pole, including the two bears, which sometimes are seen as carts. And he's seen as like herding them or riding them or somehow controlling them in some sort of fashion. And so it shows us how important this area of tropical Libra is to finding our sacred center, right? Which can only be found through the balancing of our yin and our yang, our light and our dark. 0 degrees of Libra, where the supergalactic center falls, also sits in a square to the galactic center and the pole star, which are these sacred centers, right? And so it really speaks to Libra being the activation point that activates our path to our world tree, to our axis mundi, to our mystic mountain, to our sacred center. And then there's also one of the 15, I always pronounce this word wrong, bear with me. I literally Googled how to pronounce it and wrote the pronunciation here, but my dyslexic ass is still probably going to butcher this. I'm so sorry. Behenian stars. The 15 medieval stars that are used in like medieval astrology and medieval magic. There are 15 stars. This word that I'm butchering, I'm going to spell it for you people, okay? Behenia. Bohemian. I think it's like bohemian, but said a little bit differently. The word translates to root. And these 15 stars are believed to be like the foundation of the heavens, and they were really used a lot in medieval astrology and in magical practices. There are sigils and talisman for each one of these stars, and they're used to really channel very specific energies through like spell work or esoteric or occult practices. And there is one of the 15 stars that falls here in Libra. It's called Gina. It's spelled G-I-E-N-A-H, and it means wing. There's actually 2 different stars by this name. This one, which is in the constellation Corvus, the crow, and there's also another star in Cygnus, the swan, by that same name, but it's not one of these 15 stars. It's an Arabic word, and it means wing. And this particular star is associated with the energy of Venus, Libra, right? And then also the moon. And it's used in magical practices to bring through that energy, which is so deeply feminine. Those are our two feminine signs, which I find interesting because when we think of Libra, a lot of times we think of, I mean, it's a masculine sign. It's an air sign. It is of the yang polarity. But when we think of Libra, we think of that which is feminine and pretty and love and beauty. And I've always kind of wondered where this comes from. Maybe because women are always more focused on relationships. I don't know. I've always wondered where this comes from because Libra is a masculine sign. It is an air sign. It's associated with the masculine polarity, but we look at it in such a feminine lens. Even I do. I am a Libra to a T. I like the aesthetics and the beauty and pink. I'm obsessed with pink. I'm such a Libra archetype. It's hilarious. And this fixed star, which is one of the foundations of the heavens, falls here, and it's associated with that feminine energy. All right, guys, 16 minutes, Mario. It's better than normal. Normally my videos are over 2 hours. If you guys are interested in my work and you want to come get a session, I'm actually running a sale right now for the equinox. It starts on the equinox, which is the 22nd. And if you use the code SAVE30 in all capital letters, it'll save you 30% on my galactic esoteric astrology sessions and really everything on my website, including my course. If you want to come learn galactic esoteric astrology with me, come and join my course. Right now, it is being offered at a significantly discounted rate. Once the course is finished being created, the price is going to double. So if this interests you and you want to come join us, come find me. Feel free to DM me on Instagram or send me an email or anything like that. All right, Mario, thank you so much for having me. Sorry if I went over. We both knew that was going to happen. Michelle, you too. So good to hear from you guys and see you. Hopefully we can connect again. All right.
Okay, Allie, aka the Cosmic Space Witch, thank you so much for that contribution there. I've been thinking of a sign that I thought would make sense for her to join us with, and I completely forgot she's a Libra sun sign, so that's very cool. Very nice that it works out that way. Obviously, she has a lot to say about everything. One of the things I want to say off the bat is actually the fact that she brought so much sacred center symbolism as it relates to Libra on a cosmic level. That is so fascinating to me that, obviously she's picking that up because I think a lot of people don't really know that that's sort of the case. Symbolically, Libra being the 7th sign, you could say that it's the central sign, right? And as I was saying earlier, there's a whole thing with the equinoxes and the solstices being poles. And so you can almost say that the equinox symbolically, the fall equinox is like the symbolic central pole in the zodiac, if you want to break it down that way. This is interesting as well because I see that there's a lot of pillar symbolism associated with Libra. Again, the Justice card, Lady Justice, is sitting between two pillars, so she is like the symbolic central pillar, basically, right? And so there's just a lot of world axis, pillar, pole symbolism baked into the sign, as we're kind of alluding to here and just talking about outright. My presentation, once again, the axis of Libra is where I really, really get into a lot of this stuff. And I think it's also really interesting that this theme of Libra being introduced later on, during the Roman era, is to me just intriguing because I've also heard the exact opposite. In fact, there's a guy named W.H. Mueller who I had the good fortune of meeting a couple of times online. He wrote a book called Polaria. And this book, if people are interested in polar wisdom or northern symbolism, this is like a modern classic. It was written in the 90s and it blew my mind when I read it. This guy is really, really smart and very tuned into the polar northern weave. And when we were talking one time, it was actually during Libra season. And I just wanted to kind of relay some of what I was learning about Libra being sort of a pillar, Libra having this symbolism that associates it with a tower. That's another thing. The Tower of Babel is basically kind of a symbolic pole in a lot of ways. Towers and mountains and trees are very similar that way. And I was telling him all this stuff. And he said, according to his research, that there are some esoteric Muslims that essentially have said that Libra may very well have been the first sign of the zodiac. So it's either the first sign in some people's sort of world, or it's the last sign to be introduced under some people's sort of way of looking at things. So either way, there's this kind of like alpha omega sort of thing going on with all of that. Similarly, as it relates to polar symbolism and sacred center symbolism, I know another correspondence that I've come across with Libra is that in the East, Libra was once viewed as a potter's wheel. And so what is a potter's wheel? There's a central point of pivot, and so it's like a wheel, right? And so it spins and spins. And so there's this idea of Libra kind of being this central axis, pretty much, you know. And, you know, I'll say too, it's interesting that this is potentially the center of the zodiac. And how interesting is it that when we're dealing with concepts related to the center, you do have this rotating hinge sort of thing, and then scales literally have to have that fulcrum. It has to have a point of pivot. So it all kind of just lines up in my opinion, but that's really cool that she picked up on a lot of that stuff. Also, I think it's interesting that she brought up the Bohemian stars, which to be honest, I really don't know that much about, but I just looked up the list of these 15 stars, and there are some heavy hitters up in the mix, including Algol, Aldebaran, Sirius, Regulus, Spica, and Arcturus, which she did mention, right? And I just love that Allie has integrated all of this northern symbolism into her work and practice, and that indeed is one of the things we bonded on years ago, because there's a lot of astrologers who pay no attention or give no love to the pole star, the world axis, and here she is integrating it, and then also the galactic center and all these other things. And so I've just always appreciated her perspective with all of that, and she really is integrating a lot of other additional information, you know, into her chart readings and everything else. And did you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, well, you spoke of the tower aspect with the pole.
Yeah.
And in Star Lore of All Ages, there's a quote where he says, "There are indistinct indications that in the valley of the Euphrates, the constellation now known as Libra stood for the Tower of Babel."
Yeah.
And so that really stood out to me because for obvious reasons, but you speaking of this tower aspect, it just lends credit to that for sure.
Well, you know what's kind of interesting about all of it? There's a couple of things that are probably worth unpacking here. One is that a lot of people, when they bring up the Tower of Babel, or when it's been illustrated, oftentimes it's illustrated with 7 stories, that there's 7 tiers or 7 stories to the tower. We're dealing with the 7th sign.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting. And then the other thing that's interesting about it is that the Tower of Babel story is that all of the people that existed post-flood, the Great Flood, lived in Babylon. And so Babylon was like the first civilization after the flood, and everyone came together to build this tower to essentially storm the gates of heaven. And God thwarted their plan by introducing new languages. And so there were multiple new languages that were introduced. So now everyone was speaking a different language. And so it sounded like Babel to each other. Just everyone was just babbling. And so they no longer could work on this tower together because they had no unified language. And so I think that's interesting because all of the air signs have a huge correspondence with communication, right?
Right.
And here we are dealing with sword symbolism as well. And literally within sword, you have word, or it's an anagram for words, and your words can cut like swords. And so there's a huge aspect here with communication as well with the Tower of Babel. And so there's all that.
Lady Justice is the fusion or the embodiment of the Aries Libra axis. She is illustrated bearing a sword and scales, which speak to Aries as a warrior and Libra as the scales themselves. It also symbolically speaks to the same modality of Aries and Libra, cardinal. Because besides justice and law, Lady...
All right, Jauke, thank you for that quick contribution there. You know, I hadn't really thought of the cornucopia being part of the conversation today, but he does make a good point, and there are illustrations or versions of Lady Justice, and the cornucopia is definitely in the mix. Definitely reminds me of harvest season. And also just want to say that corn, as in cornucopia, corn is literally a word that's used to indicate all grains. And so this was a word that was used, especially in Europe, to indicate, barley. It can mean corn, it can mean barley, it can mean wheat, it can mean all sorts of different things. So it's almost like the generic word for grain. And so here we just pass through Virgo, which is the grain goddess or harvest maiden. And one of the things I always think about is the grains during this harvest season, they need to be weighed before they can actually go to market. So you need to know how much grain you have. And even when you're selling, you need to weigh the grain so you know how much you're selling the person and how much it's supposed to cost and everything else. So this goes back to Libra being used, obviously, or the scales being used for weights and measures and everything else. Also, there's an interesting thing going on here with cornucopia. It's the horn of plenty as well. And there's a whole dynamic with Saturn, actually, and like horn symbolism. So like the goat has horns, right? When we're talking about Capricorn too, there's a dynamic that relates it to Pan. Pan is very much like a lusty, horny sort of deity, right? And so there is some interesting etymological things going on there. And then also Pan was basically like a pastoral sort of god. So there's like paintings and things like that, statues where Pan is playing his pan flute, amongst a field of wheat, basically golden wheat. And then even ban even means bread in some languages, right?
Right, yeah.
So it kind of comes back around. So when we're dealing with cornucopia, we're dealing with corn as in like as in grains, but then we're also dealing with horn, so the horn of plenty. So all of that was well taken, and thanks again for the submission.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the weighing of the grains, because that's been something that has been pinging me the whole time, is just the importance of weighing your harvest.
Yeah.
Especially at this time of year. And I do have another quote that goes along with this from the book Outer Space. Ancient husbandmen regarded this sign as an indication that the time had come for sowing winter grain. So not only are we dealing with the grain that you've harvested in the fall, we're dealing with the soil is now very fertile, and it's time to now sow more grain so that you can have winter grains come through.
Gotcha. Interesting. There's a whole thing with winter and grains as well.
Yes.
Because this was like the storage of calories for people to get through the winter. And so it would make sense that you're baking bread more during the winter and you're using these grains, and that it would basically, it's like a survival thing.
And they're so nutrient dense. Grains kind of get tossed to the side in the mainstream, but when you really come down to it, they're staples of all the diets throughout all cultures for good reason, because they're filling, they're high in nutrients, and they are going to store well.
Yeah, exactly. I've even made a video where I went over the seasonal glyphs. I don't know if you remember that one.
I do remember that. Yep.
But there's a glyph for spring and fall and winter and, all of them. And it's interesting that the glyph for winter, it actually kind of looks like a little storehouse, like a storage house, like a granary, basically. It looks kind of like a little dwelling, and there's like 6 or 7 dots within that little space that kind of looks like it's a grain house or whatever you want to say. And so some people have said that this is actually what this glyph represents. So really, it's a depiction of grains being stored for the winter. And it kind of also looks almost like it is sort of like a very simple home or something like that. And this is just a reminder that we spend a lot of time indoors during winter as well, right? Obviously, because it's cold out. But related to the harvest season and the weighing of the grains, I just want to say one thing that's been on my mind and is always on my mind during Libra season is that Libra is related to weights and measures. And so if you're weighing grains or you're weighing gold or precious metals or something like that, you're probably going to keep the amount somewhere. Like you're going to have a ledger, basically, of how much you have, how much you've sold, what you've made, and everything else. This is another aspect of Libra symbolism where basically it's related to ledgers. It's related to keeping books. So not just books of knowledge and stories or myths or whatever, literally like practical books for business. And so this is why we refer to the number sign as the pound sign, because we get pound from Libra Pondo, which is used to be a weight of measure, basically. So LB, the abbreviation for pound, we literally get from Libra. That basically morphed into the pound sign. So the pound sign itself has always been related to technology. And so one of my videos, I get into this, that the pound sign always relates to tech, always relates to numbers. And in fact, it was, I believe, the last button to be added to the phone so that the phone can communicate with early computer systems, basically. And so Libra and the pound sign, there's a whole interesting relationship going on there that I thought was worth mentioning.
As a Libra myself, one thing I find very fascinating is that Libra is the ruler of opposites, or considered the ruler of opposites, the scales. And astrologers rarely point out, or if ever, that Venus herself spins opposite, counterclockwise of the rest of the planets. So that was one of the things I wanted to leave a voice message to point out about Libra, a correlation that I rarely hear anybody touch upon. Best regards, Vincent.
All right, Vincent, thank you for that brief insight on Venus. Yeah, that is interesting, and I don't hear that brought up very often either. So Venus is the oddball. So compared to the other planets, it goes in the opposing direction, which I think is really interesting. And as he's saying that there is this ruler of opposites sort of dynamic with that. I would say if there's another sign that maybe could be related to that, I would say it's Gemini, which is interesting as well because Gemini, the ruling planet of Gemini, is Mercury. And Mercury and Venus are considered to be kind of consorts of each other, which I've talked about before. So Venus really truly tends to be this planet nowadays for me, and I know yourself as well. Like the more I learn about it and like get deeper information and insights into it, the more my mind is kind of blown.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of significant sort of things happening there. And I think that you could almost, and it goes like this with, I think, all of the planets and all of the signs, but you can almost underappreciate what it represents, right? Venus, we could do a whole entire show just on Venus stuff, right?
Yeah, we should.
Well, we kind of have.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually have the grace of Venus.
The grace of Venus.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's just another good point to bring up. And sort of this balance of opposites thing, I think, comes into play as well with his transition to the night side of the zodiac, crossing the equinox, so the opposing side of the year is coming through, and sort of the opposing dynamic, the leaves falling, nature receding, all that kind of stuff is obviously happening right now.
Yeah, and this whole concept of Venus going in the opposite direction, to me, what's coming through is that it really does point to the origin or the source of perhaps where we come from, as Venus is the goddess, and kind of what we've learned through people like Ola Woolney. It's actually Venus that is potentially one of the more important planets that we should be looking towards, or that there's so much more that Venus offers than what's generally understood.
Right, exactly. So this opposing direction or rotation really speaks to that.
Yes.
All right, that's going to do it for our voicemails for today. But there is one final note I wanted to get to before we wrap it up. And it's interesting that Libra is the 7th sign of the zodiac. And when we're talking about symbolism related to the 7, which I've gone on and on and on about this before, but the number 7 really is kind of like the number of this domain or reality. 7 days of the week, 7 colors of the rainbow. It goes on and on and on. There's this idea as well that the journey from this domain to the other side, the great beyond, if you will, that there's 7 veils or there's 7 thresholds that you kind of have to cross. There's some schools of alchemy that make use of a 7-stepped system, that there's 7 processes to transmutation. And when you're talking about 7 symbolism, you're talking about septenary symbolism. So SEPT, right? So like the septagon would be the 7-sided shape. And we're in September. So the old true meaning of September relates back to the number 7. So sept. So this is actually the 7th month after the beginning of the astrological year. If you're going by the typical Gregorian calendar, it's the 9th month, but you can imagine it as actually the 7th month as well. And this is the beginning of the 7th sign. So I think that's kind of intriguing for what it's worth. Just this curious dynamic with September, and then even October, octagon, right? Now you're dealing with the 8, and now you're dealing with the 8th sign of the zodiac, which is Scorpio. So I just wanted to throw that out there for what it's worth.
Awesome. Great points as usual. I'm glad you threw it in.
Many thanks. All right, guys, that's going to do it. Much love and appreciation to everyone who submitted something. We will see you soon for an episode on the symbolism of Scorpio.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, this concludes the live recording Michelle and I made on Monday, September 22nd. I really do love this sign, although it did take me a number of years to fully appreciate it. As always, a big thank you to everyone who submitted something, but especially Emily Ridout, Katriena Emmanuel, Sarah Henlin, and Allie, the Cosmic Space Witch. The ever insightful Emily Ridout can be found at astroyoga.org or emilyridout.com. If you're curious about her astrological services or yoga services, definitely seek her out there. She's also facilitating an astro yoga retreat to Iceland later this month. So if you're interested, she might be able to squeeze you in. Definitely touch base with Emily for any questions. Sarah's Instagram can be found at Sarah_Henlin. That's SAHRA_Henlin if you want to follow her posts. I'm also happy to say Sarah will be a regular contributor to the podcast moving forward, which I'm really excited about. Katriena from Australia not only has amazing insights, but she's also a gifted photographer as well. You can see her work and find her other links at katrienaemmanuel.com. That's KatrienaEmmanuel.com. You'll also be hearing more from her because she has become a regular contributor as well. I said it earlier, but I really think we're putting together something of a symbolic dream team. And last but not least, we have Allie, the Cosmic Space Witch. All of her services, products, and links can be found at thecosmicspacewitch.com. Show her some love and give her a follow. I'm glad she was able to join us for this deep dive into all things Libra. Also, once again, I am available for tarot readings, study sessions, and symbolic birth chart readings. It's truly a pleasure to meet all of you and talk symbolism. You could book a session on my site, or as always, you can text me at 503-893-4606 for more information. As always, for exclusive content, head on over to patreon.com/symbolicstudies or symbolicstudies.com/secrets. I try and post weekly updates every weekend. Every other weekend, I post something exclusive just for supporters. As an example, this podcast is available early for subscribers. Without a doubt, this is the best way to keep up with everything I have to offer, and it's just $5 a month. I also have to mention the fact that I am a lifelong graphic designer, and it's actually through graphic design I found the study of symbolism. You can check out my portfolio on my site, and if you have a project in need of a designer, don't hesitate to reach out. Lastly, it occurred to me recently that a number of people are now listening to the audio portion of this show who have never seen my videos or presentations. So I just want to say that if you're new to symbolic studies, I really encourage you to check out my YouTube and Instagram page for videos and other long-form content. In fact, my short videos are easily what I'm the most well-known for, so if you haven't come across those, you really need to. Links for all of my accounts can be found at symbolicstudies.com. And that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next month with a show on the symbolism of Scorpio. Until then.